It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for our first colloquium of the winter term. We're delighted to have the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies present a lecture that uses historical research to give us, as it were, a peek into people's private lives, although I'm sure we're going to question how much of a peek we actually get. Our fellow, Professor Evyatar Marienberg, will be speaking on his extensive research on Jewish sexual guidance throughout history. And while we don't have records, of course, of what actually went on in people's bedrooms, Professor Marienberg has found that the guidance offered by rabbinical authorities provide really fascinating insights into different historical and cultural periods. Professor Marienberg is an assistant professor and the E.J. and Sarah Evans Fellow of Jewish History and Culture at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His education has taken him on an odyssey through diverse religious institutions. He grew up in Haifa, studied at Yeshivat HaKibbutz Hadati in Ein Surim. Later he studied Catholic theology at the Institut Catholique de Paris and religious studies at the École Pratique des Hautes Études en Sorbonne. My French is not that wonderful. And he received his doctorate from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. So his research focuses not just on the subject of this talk on Jewish sexual guidance, but also on Christianity and on Judaism, as well as on comparative studies. He has served as a visiting fellow and lectured at many prestigious institutions throughout the world. He's the author of 2 books, both of them in French, that focus on Nida, the Jewish religious laws concerning menstruation, and one of the books, which is in English, Catholicism Now, an introduction to the contemporary Catholic Church. So please join me in welcoming Evyatar Marienberg.
Thank you very much. While not obligatory, it is. I will. It's just story time. While not obligatory, it is a sign of religious piety to refrain from marital relations on public fast days. The fast of Gedalia, the 10th of the Tevet, the fast of Esther, and the 17th of Tammuz, and on the night following the 9th of Av. If, however, the 9th of Av was postponed from Shabbat to Sunday, marital relations are permitted on the night following the fast. According to Kabbalah, it is praiseworthy to refrain from marital relations on both nights of Rosh Hashanah and other holy days. However, these are stringencies, not binding rules. A person who considers himself worthy may adopt such standards of piety, provided that they are acceptable to his spouse as well. However, the mitzvah supersedes these practices. Thus, for example, if the wife's night of immersion after her menstrual impurity falls on one of these days, or if she expresses a strong desire to be with her husband, the couple should engage in marital relations. So good afternoon, and thank you, Deborah, for the presentation, and thank you all for being here. Yes, Professor Dashmore said a bit about what I'm going to talk about, and I'll try to do it in some, I hope, coherent way. Some of you know, some people here that are fellow and we talked about, I see myself as a historian of religions with particular interest in the study of beliefs and practices of late Jews and Christians from various periods. In my work on Judaism, which I will focus on today, I give a special place to prescriptive text, taking always into account the inevitable gap, also was mentioned, between them and the reality. The gap we all know between the prescriptive and the descriptive. Prescriptive text touching on question of sexuality are of particular interest for me. And for several years, I indeed worked on issues related to menstruation, and then I moved to rules not what people should not do, which are particularly their laws related to menstruation, but what people should do when they can do that. So my current major project is a book-length study on Jewish guides of sexuality. In my study, I devote particular place to the questions you see here on the screen. So I asked, for example, what type of written guidance on the marital sexual act were available to Jewish readers through history? I asked, did the available guidance regarding the sexual act differ from one generation to the next? If so, how did the historical and cultural context of each work or generation affect the prescribed rules of sexual conduct? Were Jewish works on the subject different from non-Jewish works of the same time and places? We can ask, for example, Jewish works that were produced in Christian lands, are they the same like Muslim lands? If we compare them, or if we compare inside the culture? Can we deduce anything from these texts regarding actual behavior in Jewish bedrooms? That's a question that might be interesting for many people. We might have some answers to that. And I will show a case today in which I think we could know something about what happened. My book-length study of traditional Jewish texts on the marital sexual act attempts to provide some answers to these questions. Obviously, I cannot cover in one talk this entire project, and I will not even try. I will speak today only about a small selection of text and some historical moments that are part of this larger history, but I hope it will give a taste of the bigger project. I will not speak about the 21st century text aiming at modern Orthodox population like the one I read earlier. The text I read is an English version published in 2008 of a Hebrew work published in 2005, which is a revised version of a previous one published in 2003. Okay, and this is a book, this is actually a booklet which is attached to a bigger book. The bigger book is basically mostly about the issues related to nida, so menstruation, how to deal with your in-laws, how to deal when there are tensions, who you go to during the holidays, to his parents or her parents. But at the very end, there is a little booklet which is sealed when you buy it. And this is a guide to marital relations from a Torah perspective. It is only for married people or for people engaged. Okay, so this is a separate little booklet there. I am not going to speak about this because today I'm actually going to stop in works or in events that happened around the 1960s. So this is a part of a later type. For the fellows here, I will have a workshop in which I will speak about more contemporary stuff. What I decided to focus today is on one 20th century episode related to the topic, its causes and its implications. At the same time, I wanted to give you a taste of earlier works as well. I will therefore first describe some aspect of my method and the scope of my work, then fly through the relevant biblical sources. I will make 2 short stops in the Talmudic period. I will let someone else describe one medieval Kabbalistic text on the matter called the Holy Letter. We will see together shortly a 19th century text called Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and then we explore the content and the reasons for the appearance of an important influential text on the matter in the Haredi, or as it was called in the past, or by some today, ultra-Orthodox world in the 1960s. Before we continue, I have just a quick questions because I could not decide myself, so a quick vote. Who's for the first couple, who's for the second couple?
Well, we have to ask which one.
Which one you want? You want Barbara Streisand and Mandy Patinkin, or which?
We always want Barbara Streisand.
Barbara Streisand. Okay, fine. Thank you. Thank you. Morrison. You surely notice that I speak a lot about texts. I use text even though it is pretty obvious that the vast majority of information on this matter is passed orally. Maybe a father would take his son to see pigs and cows and talk about the mysteries of life. In fact, in rural communities, it is very possible that the son saw what the cows or the dogs are doing well before the father needed to accomplish this sensitive task. Or maybe one girl would tell another one that what she saw her parents doing. In times and places which most people did not have the type of privacy we are used to, and entire families resided sometimes in one room, sexual activity was most probably more visible and more audible. Most people probably did not need and could not read written texts on the matter, but got their education on the matter through other means. Unfortunately, we have no access to these oral exchanges. All we have for most periods are texts, if at all. For the 20th and 21st century, I actually do have oral information, which I use in 2 chapters of my book, but this is exception to the rule, and today I am not going to speak about these later events. Surprisingly, the question I'm interested in have been only rarely explored by scholars. This is true not only in Jewish studies, but in the study of other religious traditions as well. Many studies on religion and sexuality in recent years have tended to focus either on the heterosexual female experience or on homosexuality, lesbianism. The current, well-justified tendency to study expression of sexuality that were long excluded from research seems at times to lead to a lack of interest in a type of sexuality that is, after all, and probably by far, the most common type: sexuality between a man and a woman who are married and committed to one another over an extended period. It's this type of sexual activity I am interested in. All of this brings us to my biggest problem. My work deals almost exclusively with prescriptions written by men and aiming almost solely for a male audience. Half of the population affected by these regulations is entirely missing. Women were unquestionably also instructed about marital relations, but during many periods, it is very likely that this was done almost entirely orally by female family members, peers, or women who did this professionally. Unfortunately, I have absolutely no information about the procedure or the content of such an oral instruction before our own time. I do analyze a few pre-modern works that were written for women, although still by men, in one of my chapters on early modern period, as well as contemporary works for women, which do exist. Information about, and I also have information about oral guidance, the way it is done today. But it ends with this. Obviously, there is little one can do to solve this problem. There are simply no sources. Let us stop now, at least for a while, discussing issues of method and explore a text or a certain collection of text, not just any collection, the Bible itself. The Bible, and in this talk the word Bible refers only to books that are considered part of the Jewish Bible, supposedly act as the basis of anything Jewish. Does the Bible, a collection of texts written more or less between the 9th and the 2nd century BCE, guide its reader regarding sex? Does it instruct them to have relations and tell them how to? Well, there are 2 important and rather famous texts on the matter in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. They are famous. One is, and you see in bold, God created mankind, and God says, be fruitful and increase in number. Okay? This is a commandment, or this is a blessing. Not very clear, and it was not very clear for readers of the Bible for centuries. So this is one thing. But we can assume that if God tells them to be fruitful and increase in number, God assumed that sex should be involved in the process. Then we have another text in Genesis 2. So Adam, right? Adam, poor guy, doesn't have helper, no one to wash the dishes. And then what happens? God creates the woman, and then we have at the end, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Again, is this a description of a reality, or is this something that one should do? Okay? Not very clear, and because it's not very clear, again, volumes were written during history by Jews and Christians about trying to understand this text. Leaving aside these 2 important yet vague verses from Genesis, is the Bible a good place to look for actual practical guidance on sex? Some say that it is. Quote, "The Bible is the oldest but still the wisest," no, I should try it again. "The Bible is the oldest but still the wisest guide to sex ever written," says the person who was the big kahuna of sex for a while in this country, Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Once she came to my talk, I did not know for sure how she looks before. I knew she's very short, and then a very short person came to me and said, "Hallo, ich bin," no, okay. Others, including myself, so she says that the Bible is the biggest sex guide. She wrote a book about it. Others, including myself, are a bit more skeptical. The Bible speaks often about type of sexual relations that its authors considered forbidden. But does the Bible have much to say about relations that it considers legitimate? In most biblical books, not much, if anything, is spoken about such acts. In some books, though, we do find direct or indirect references to them, including, in a few cases, material that can be read as instructing or at least describing the how-to of such relations. Thus, for example, the idea that using perfumes, scented oils, beautiful clothes, and sumptuous bedcloth can attract and arouse the partner appears in various places. One can also learn that there can be an element of joy in sexual relations, and that alcohol can enable unconscious or less conscious sex. Sexual relations also include the revealing of the man's lower parts, spreading of the woman's legs, active repeated movements, and fondling and caressing of breasts and bosom. In one book, the strongly erotic Song of Songs, one can also hear that a man might enjoy holding the woman's breasts and resting between them, and that an appropriate position during sexual relations is in one in which the man's left arm is under the woman's head and his right arm embraces her. And last, but certainly not least, in one place in the Bible, the story of Samson and Delilah, acts that we might describe today as bondage, discipline, sadism, and masochism, or for the connoisseur, BDSM, are rather apparent. At least it seemed a very plausible reason for why Samson asked his fair lady, Delilah, to tie him with ropes. You can see all relevant biblical references from which I took all these statements on this slide. There is nothing else. This is, no matter how one looks at it, not much by way of guidance. And this is all the Bible provides about the how-to of the sexual act. Very clearly, Jewish authors had more than enough freedom to try to fill in these blanks. All this together will make, I would say, a short biblical chapter, which is about 0.1% of the Hebrew Bible. So this is really not much. What happens then in later texts? The answer to this question depends rather on the person asked. In fact, according to some popular contemporary notions about sexuality in Judaism, sex is widely celebrated in Jewish sources. It is not that Jews are described in popular cultural jokes as sex god and goddesses. Far from it. But according to a typical depiction, the blame for this fact is to be found not in the real Jewish tradition, but in some false Victorian Christian version of Judaism. Authentic Judaism, we are often told, in inauthentic Judaism, kosher sex between husband and wife is a sacred endeavor and a key to heaven both here and beyond. Unlike Christian thinkers, goes this narrative, the rabbis spoke about a sexual act regularly and shamelessly, insisting that there is nothing disgraceful about it, and emphasizing that one who engages in illicit sex is accomplishing an important commandment, a mitzvah, regardless of whether the act may lead or not to procreation. In reality, this presentation of Jewish attitudes about sex is hardly tenable. At best, it is based on a patchwork of a small number of references to sexual relations spread over the vast corpus of rabbinic literature. The sources presented in this type of works are always selections. The authors of many of these apologetic books pick those quotes that pair well with what they want to present as the Jewish tradition, and simply ignore the rest, which might very well say the exact opposite. These contemporary authors have to do things this way because only a small number of pre-modern Jewish treatises or chapters in larger works are devoted to the sexual act itself. Even worse, out of those sources available, a significant number are of legal or halachic nature. For various reasons, but probably mostly related to the lack of teaching of this topic in universities, very few real or pseudo-scholars actually dare to look at halachic legal sources, despite the fact that until the modern period, the impact of Jewish law, of halacha, on Jewish life was crucial. Understanding halacha, the Jewish legal system, can help one understand much about Judaism. This must be a given for anyone who knows anything about Jewish culture. But did halacha also shape the actual sexual practices of Jews? The answer to this question is not simple. We rarely know what people do in their bedrooms. Prescriptive texts on the matter and halachic texts are prescriptive in nature and only occasionally may be said to be descriptive, can help us understand what people were perhaps told they should do in the bedroom. While discussing related texts of the Talmud period, a scholar of rabbinics, Judith Baskin, justly wrote, "It is impossible to know what degree rabbinic legislation governing sexual relations between husband and wife reflected realities in any particular time and place, and to what extent it represent idealized rhetorical expressions of how Jewish family life ought to be regulated." Baskin is unquestionably correct, and her statement is also true with reference to texts from later period, many of which I study. This gap between the literary description and prescription regarding the sexual act and the reality is, of course, not a problem unique to the study of Judaism. Although the study of prescriptive text is at the center of our first book, Kisha Ali, a scholar of Islamic law, asked honestly in its introduction, why, though, focus on text when Islamic normative doctrine has never been entirely reliable as an indicator of Muslim practice? The effect of social circumstances on both the formulation and the implementation of the law has always been of central importance. Real women's and men's lives do not neatly follow the pattern set out in legal manuals and have never done so. Dealing, like me, with issues of sexuality, Ali acknowledges the same problem we have. For the sensitive subject under discussion here, empirical evidence concerning practice is difficult to obtain. But still, she concludes, there is relationship between ideal and reality. One of my tasks in working on Jewish prescriptive sources about marital relation is to think about the nature of this relationship between the ideal, as defined by the author of the text, and the reality in Jewish bedrooms. In some cases, I think I can carefully propose ways to bridge this gap and suggest that there is an actual correlation between prescription and reality. I will try to do today showing a case of this kind. Having done all this, let us go back to some text, beginning with the most elementary one in any understanding of rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud. The core of the Talmudic literature, a literature composed between the 3rd and the 7th century CE, is made of 63 tractates on rather diverse issues. But among them, there is no tractate on how to have sex. One cannot even speak about a section devoted to it. At best, one can find some paragraphs related to the matter assembled into few tractates. Other than that, like in some but not all of the other types of literature I explore in my study, one must assemble short texts from diverse places in order to create the never-written manual to marital sexuality of that time and place. In fact, the need for such a manual, or at least some instruction on the matter, was expressed very clearly in the Babylonian Talmud itself, in a short and rather famous story in tractate Brachot. Rav Kana once went in and hid under the Rav's bed. He heard him chatting with his wife and joking and doing what he needed. He said to him, "One would think that the master mouth had never sipped the dish before." He said to him, "Kahana, are you here? Go out. It is not the way of the world to behave like this." He replied, "It is a matter of Torah and I need to learn." This text, since it does not criticize the disciple, and it was included in the Talmud, seems to support indirectly the request of the disciple. masters should also teach this knowledge about how to have sex to their students. When I examined Talmudic texts on the matter, I arranged them under the categories you will see now on the screen. So I take text and I say, what do they speak about? So some speak about before the act, some about undressing, lights off, everybody's out, the timing, the frequency, foresex, foreplay, position, you see other position, speaking during sex, correct thoughts, and including divine rewards if you do things. So many of the texts you can put into these categories there. There are Talmudic texts on each and every one of these, and often multiple and contradicting ones. The importance of understanding them is particularly crucial for my project, not so much in understanding what Talmudic rabbis or editors thought, but in the fact that these spread statements became the building blocks for almost any later Jewish text on the matter. I chose one example of a Talmudic text on marital sexuality to show how it had an impact on subsequent text and apparently actual behavior. The specific text I chose is relevant to all of the categories that you see in green. Okay, so you see the text I'm going to show is related to the issue of undressing, timing, correct thoughts, length of sex, and divine rewards. Let's see it. So this is from Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Nedarim. They asked Ima Shalom. Ima Shalom, you see, she was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus. He was born around 40 CE and died around 120 CE. These are just general to tell you what we're talking about. It's a first century CE person. They asked Ima Shalom, why are your children so exceedingly beautiful? She said to them, he does not converse with me either at the beginning or at the end of the night, but rather does so at midnight. And when he converses, he uncovers a handbreadth and covers a handbreadth. And it is as though he is compelled by a demon. Pretty scary, I would say. I asked him, what is the reason? He said to me, so that I may not look at other women, lest my children will be bastards. Okay? What you see here, the color that I did, I basically tried to divide them. So there is the idea of divine reward, right? They're beautiful. The length of sex might be compelled by demon. Is this related to how he's doing it? Is this related to the speed? So this is why I did it like it's maybe related to time. And correct thoughts. Okay, is this related to thoughts? Because we have other texts that speak about thought. But this is something, maybe not to have a ménage à trois, okay, or something like this. We do not want to think about another person. What exactly did Ima Shalom's husband do according to the story? What did she mean when she said that he was uncovering a handbreadth and covering a handbreadth? And what in his behavior made him look to her as though he was compelled by a demon? I'm not sure. The most common understanding of this paragraph is that the story expresses the idea that the husband, assumingly Rabbi Eliezer, avoided relation in full nudity and made sure that the couple had only minimal parts of their body exposed. To keep them covered, he used their clothes, or perhaps a bed cover of some kind. No more than a hairbreadth of the naked body would be uncovered at any moment. Being so anxious about this issue and acting in a way that is, in our time, would probably be called, at least by lay observers, obsessive-compulsive, or perhaps finishing the act extremely quickly, suffering perhaps some premature ejaculation, he was described by Ima Shalom, using her own pre-psychiatric terms, as compelled by demon. This explanation is more or less given by most major medieval commentators on the Talmud, as well as more recent ones. It is indeed a very plausible one, considering the general aesthetic image of Rabbi Eliezer, known also from other sources. Other explanations can be suggested, but for lack of time, I will not deal with them today. The Talmud probably reached its more or less final form around the 8th century CE, more or less, but Jewish scholarship obviously continued, and the output of these scholars is manifest in later texts. In today's presentation, I cover a few of them. I decided to jump from the Talmud to the 13th century to a very central text in the history of Jewish sexual guidance, a text generally known as the Holy Letter, which is, if we consider its style and genre, part of Kabbalistic literature that emerged at that time in the area which is today southern France and northern Spain. It is a fascinating text. For centuries, it was attributed to a major Jewish medieval scholar of 13th century Spain, Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides, another guy. But a famous Kabbalah scholar, Gershom Scholem, suggested it is probably not his, and later scholars confirmed this. I decided not to read or show paragraphs from this text myself, but rather to ask more polished presenters to do this for me. In fact, I had this choice because the text is explicitly used in at least 2 Hollywood films. I asked you, and you voted, so you said that you want to see Yentl. Barbara Streisand. For those who never saw the film or saw it a long time ago, here's a little refresher, because it's too complicated. So you can see it yourself. We're good? We're good. Light here can do little, this light maybe? Thank you.
Where are you going? Ansel? Look at the shoulders. Look.
You're not leaving, are you?
I have a wedding present for you.
Oh,
For both of you.
thank you.
Rahman, the holy letter. He wrote it over 500 years ago. Converse with her to put her mind at ease. Speak words which arouse you to love, desire, and passion. And words of reverence for God.
Never force her. Her mood must be as yours. Win her with graciousness and seductiveness. Be patient until her passion is aroused. Begin with love. And when her mood is ready, let her desire be satisfied first. Her delight is what matters.
You have a good session.
Thank you. You want to dance with them? Yentl is based on a play by the Nobel Prize-winning author Isaac Bashevis Singer. This scene, though, is not in the original play, which is fascinating, by the way. It was invented and created by Streisand and her co-writer for the script, Jack Rosenthal. This scene obviously simplifies the text. It also attributed to Nachmanides, which we know it's not true, but the text is real. The scene we saw only mentions 1 paragraph from a much larger work. Nevertheless, you get the point. There is indeed a Jewish medieval text that goes into interesting detail when it describes how sexual relations should take place, and it truly had a rather positive attitude towards the topic. In my project, this text is analyzed thoroughly, including its history and the history of its later transmission, interpretation, and impact. In this film, how Streisand heard about it, I know today, how it was used in another film, A Stranger Among Us. I talked with the screenwriter, how he used it. So this text got kind of pretty famous in Hollywood. Let us jump again about 7 centuries. So you can imagine there are much in between, and see a 19th century text which is quite a good example of the way sexual activity was codified in halachic literature by then, meaning by the 19th century. Since the last third of the 19th century, one of the most popular compendia of Jewish law for Ashkenazi Jewry, a work which was very accessible because of its content, language, length, and not less important, price, has been the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, abbreviation of the Shulchan Aruch, composed by Hungarian Rabbi Shlomo Ganzfried. The title hints that this is an abbreviation of the Shulchan Aruch, literally dressed or prepared table. Shulchan Aruch is a 16th century work, which is to this day the most important book of Jewish law. The reality is much more complicated. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is not an abbreviation of the major work. It is something else. It used the Shulchan Aruch, of course, but it used actually three other authors that are later. But the title is brilliant. By calling this the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, you made it marketable. I want to say something else. I did not plan, but especially because some people who work in the Jewish studies in different aspects. The book today is considered to be like a low-level thing. This is just, it's very strict, it's Hungarian, it's not serious, and no one took it ever seriously. And it's just for, for guys that do not know how to read real halakha. This is a very interesting presentation, but it is a recent one. It is post-Holocaust invention. The book was extremely respected. There were study groups of the book all over Europe. We know today that it is most probably the number third in publication in Jewish history after Siddur and Haggadah. Okay, so Haggadah for Passover and Siddur are the most printed. Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, number 3. We're talking about some scholars said 2 to 3 million copies of this book. So we are talking a book that had huge impact and respected, not what today people hear in yeshivot. It's a very interesting case. More than that, it has today image that it's very strict. The reality is, it is not. And I worked quite extensively on that. No, I'm not sure how this myth was created, but it's just an interesting case. Anyway, in this book, which was also translated to many languages, and also for Americans, it was the first book of Jewish law that was easily available in English in this country, so it also shaped decades of Jews. This was the book of halakha they had at home. The book has 221 chapters, and chapter 150 is on our topic. It is made of 17 paragraphs, and I decided to bring only 2 of them. So remember, this is not the same thing. Okay. It is fitting that, you can read. You can see it? Or, yeah? Okay. So this is the beginning of chapter 150. Okay. I grew up modern Orthodox in Israel, and as a kid, I had 2 sources to know about sex. It was the big encyclopedia, which was not a good thing, and this. And years later, when I asked people, I started to do this research, I realized I was not the only one. Okay, many friends from different places, this is what they have. Why? Because the book was available. You could open it, no one knows. You open chapter 150 on this, or you open chapter 75 about blessing after meals, right? I mean, who knows? So this is a book that had impact on people. Not a good one, probably. Here is another paragraph. Okay, you got a point? Now you know what to do? Okay, so these are 2 paragraphs from 17. And this is kind of by the 18th, 19th century. This is kind of the typical, pretty similar things. Actually, what he did here, he took material from the Shulchan Aruch, he rearranged it, he made some relatively minor changes. He added a few things, some from Maimonides, some other things, a little Kabbalistic thing at some place, and he made one actually pretty good from literary perspective text, pretty coherent, pretty clear about the material, and this became a pretty standard, more or less. Texts like these were also included often in prayer books, in Sidurim. Today, when we speak about prayer book, we think that's the book you take when you go to synagogue to pray or when you pray at home. But in the past, these books were much more comprehensive, and people would use them for everything. So for many things. Also this, you know it in Christian culture, people would, like, you write your birth dates or death of people on the missal. So it was also used for things that are not related to prayer, and texts like this appeared after the evening service. Makes sense, right? Sex, at night, okay, so they put this text like this. So they were extremely available, easily reachable for people. Marital relations are by now, with these texts like this, codified. Whoever wishes to know how to perform them can find what he, or in theory, she, is looking for in the Kitzur or in similar works. What we saw here until now, I spoke about the project, I spoke about the scope, the method, the problems, and we've seen some sample of text. We've seen Bible, we've seen Talmud, we've heard from Streisand and friends the Holy Letter, and we saw 2 paragraphs of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Before concluding, as I said, I want to explore a 20th century episode related to the topic. Among other things, it shows an example of a possible way to know something about the actual reality in bedrooms, not only the religious prescriptions. It also shows that these texts are not only important for understanding history, but also for understanding the present in some traditional Jewish communities. The Haredi, or as it was known in the past, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world, is a segment of Jewish Orthodoxy. Probably around 5% of Jews worldwide are part of it. It is a very diverse and complex world. One generalization that might be correct is that its members believe in the extreme importance of adhering to Jewish law as they understand it, and in listening to those who they believe have the authority to interpret it. Another generalization is that Haredi Jews believe, to various degrees, that there should be clear borders between their communities and the outside non-Haredi world. Books on sexual guidance exist, not surprisingly, in the Haredi communities. In this slide, you can see 3 examples of influential books published in recent decades. I will not analyze any of them today, but instead explore briefly an event that happened with the publication of not a book of this kind, but rather a letter. The person you see on the left side, Rabbi Israel Alter, was the 4th leader, Rabbi or Rebbe, of the Hasidic dynasty of Ger or Gur. On the right side, you see an image from a marriage of members of his group. Alter held the position from 1948 until his death in 1977. As their leader, he decreed many rules for the members of his group. One collection of rules that dealt with sexuality. These rules were never published, as far as I know, in writing, but passed orally. Only about 2 years ago, a woman who is an ex-member of the group put them into writing and published them in a blog. Among other things, these instructions direct the couple to never kiss the other body, to practice only the man on top position, to be dressed, to not have relations before midnight, to keep silent, to fulfill the act quickly, and to have relation not more than twice a month. It is obviously easy to say that Alter had some deep-seated problems with sexuality. Well, knowing his biography, we might understand that, although this might be true, it is rather hard to judge him. Alter's entire family, including his wife, 2 children and grandchildren, were killed by the Nazis. He survived to escape to Palestine. Here he married, but never had children again. Many Hasidic groups were exterminated during the Holocaust and disappeared from the Jewish map. Alter succeeded in reviving the almost non-existing Ger Hasidic group by actively attracting new followers and led this group to become the biggest and in some aspects the most successful and admired Hasidic group in Israel. Alter did not invent ex nihilo the ideas that sexual relations should be accomplished very quickly and while dressed. In fact, he had a Talmudic story to rely on. You even know it by now. Particularly because of the success, prestige, and visibility of Alter's community, the strict rules he enacted were hard for others to accept, despite the fact that, yes, they all knew about this Talmudic text. In the mid-1960s, I still could not find the exact date, an open letter was published anonymously in the Haredi world. It was quickly revealed that it was completed by Yaakov Israel Kanievsky, which you see here, also known as the Stipler, an appellation based on the name of his village of origin in Ukraine. Kanievsky was one of the most respected poskim, or decision maker, of Jewish law in his generation. It was very quickly obvious that the letter by Kanievsky is against Alter rules, even though the letter does not say it explicitly. According to one tradition, Kanievsky's letter was written after the son of an acquaintance of his joined the Ger community Hasidic group and decided to follow these rules against the will of his wife. Another legend says that it was written because young women in the Haredi, this is maybe not a legend, it has some serious truth in it, that it was written because young women in the Haredi world systematically declined marriage offers from male members of the Ger community, knowing that marrying them would mean a very controlled and cold, intimate life. Kanievsky describes in his letter the point of view of women who are married to men who follow these rules. Such a strong letter was almost truly written only after understanding the direness of the situation, and that the phenomena described in it are common. After all, to write a public letter on such an intimate issue is not something such a leader would have done without very serious thought. Let us look at some paragraphs from this letter of Kanievsky. I'll read it, I think it's too small. It is true that removing oneself from the desire of this world is of great importance when it is done for the sake of heaven, to please one's Creator. It is not appropriate, though, if it is done in order to achieve higher spiritual levels. This is a striking sentence from a leader of a religious group. Okay? It is not appropriate to achieve higher spiritual levels. Okay? The obligation of a husband to have a relation with his wife is a positive commandment from the Torah, similar to eating matzah on Passover. Interesting comparison, one might say, but also when you know Talmud, you might know that the Talmud itself actually is doing this, saying that someone that has sex with his fiancée in the house of her father is like eating matzah before the Seder night. Okay. Whoever fails to keep it commits a grave sin, unless his wife agrees to that, truly and wholeheartedly. He is a sinner, and such a sin is in the category of sin between one and one's fellow, that even Yom Kippur, okay, the day of great pardon, and death do not absolve. He is like a thief and a robber who robs his wife from what he is obligated to give her. And it is like shedding her blood, because it is well known the main desire for a woman is to have a loving husband. And when she sees that hers is not, this causes a great sorrow. And sometimes this is almost life-threatening because of the great sorrow and pain caused by her being alone, like a widow whose husband is alive. It is pretty obvious that he spoke with women. Hearing that, okay? You hear their voices there behind this text. The act of copulation is explained in the Sidur of Yavetz. As I told you, often it's in books of prayer books. So he says this is the most accessible to everybody. Go to this Sidur and see it. Look there attentively and know that what is written there is the absolute law, because according to the law of the Torah, it is forbidden to have intercourse if the woman is not agreeable. And the man must make her agreeable by closeness and hugging and kissing until she desires copulation. It is a sin to do what brings sorrow to one's wife, even if one is doing it as a pious and chaste act, because one cannot consider acts as pious when they rob his wife, treating her as an imprisoned maid. And whoever grabs and penetrates immediately, without closeness, and then retires immediately and distances himself from the woman, he obviously thinks that he reaches high levels by doing this. But, although his desire is calmed with full satisfaction, his wife does not enjoy it at all. Worse, she is pained and embarrassed, and in secret she cries, and her tears are not in vain, as the heavenly gates of tears are never closed. Definitely, whoever does this brings about himself divine sanction, heaven forbid, and he will not merit divine help, not spiritually, not materially. This, you can hardly say harsher words in religious context than that. The fact that he thinks that he ascends spiritually is a vain and misleading act of imagination, because one is rather damaged and becomes impure from sins. One does not rise through them. And then the end, or end of what I brought here, I mean, the text itself is longer, but it's not too long, because it is a letter that should be available to people and read quickly. It is true that many disciples of the sage and other pious men behave with chastity regarding these issues. He has a problem now, because some of the text, you remember the text of the Talmud we've seen, right, about Rabbi Eliezer. He says to do that. So what, he cannot just say, ignore the Talmud. He cannot say, ignore the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. So it's true that many do that. But this is only with the full consent of the wife, when she forgives this wholeheartedly. And this is most often only after she realizes that her husband loves her and that he overcomes his desire only for the sake of heaven. This can also happen when the woman is exemplary in piety and good deeds, and her real wish is that her husband should sanctify himself. Heaven forbid a man from behaving by this method of piety when this would cause pain to his wife, if she has not forsaken wholeheartedly the intimacy that he owes her. The 20th century Haredi Rabbi Alter, the leader of the Ger Hasidim, considered the behavior of the first century Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus as a model for the members of his group, what they should follow. The 20th century Rabbi Kanievsky, they knew very well one another, thought this is to be an extremely bad idea. And publicly he condemned it. The center of the debate might be around the question of whether rules and practice of religious elite, however we define elite, should be followed by or prescribed to the masses. What happens if such practices contradict other rules? Is a person allowed to decide to follow such rules without his or her partner agreement? I said earlier that when possible, I try to understand the reality, not only the prescriptions. The ways to do it are diverse, and there is no one theory fits all. Occasionally, though, I found that by looking carefully at a moment of change or of serious confrontation between contemporary opinions, one can sometimes find clues about actual behavior. I think this case is a good example. If people were not following Alter rules, Kanievsky would not have intervened. His acts tell us something about the reality around him. The first century Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, was certainly right in saying that often the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Many Jews probably wanted to follow the rules they were told. The more pious were probably trying to adhere to these prescriptions with various rates of success. The less pious were probably breaking them or ignoring them with various rates of guilt. In my project, I want to know as much as possible what Jews were told to do, and occasionally, when possible, what they did in their bedrooms. Thank you.